The moving truck's tires were still crunching on the gravel of my driveway when I spotted her. She was marching across the street with the determined stride of a general invading hostile territory. It was 8:30 on a Tuesday morning, and she was decked out in a designer tennis outfit, clutching a clipboard like a scepter. Everything about her posture screamed that she was on a mission to ruin someone's day. In less than a minute, this woman would be dialing 911 to report me for trespassing on my own property. In 3 hours, she would discover that I didn't just own this house, I owned every property on Waterfront Boulevard, including the one she called home. My name is Jackson Reeves, and this was the most significant real estate play of my life, though no one in this pristine lakeside community was aware of it yet. 6 months ago, I was a burnt-out tech executive after 15 years in the startup grind. My wife, Sarah, had passed away 2 years earlier from a sudden brain aneurysm at just 34. She left me with a life insurance payout I didn't know what to do with and a desperate need to escape the Silicon Valley environment that had consumed our marriage. This lake house was meant to be my sanctuary, a quiet place to figure out my next chapter. Hadn't expected to find myself in a war zone disguised as a peaceful suburb. The woman approaching my driveway moved with the unshakable confidence of someone who had never been denied anything. Her platinum blonde hair was styled with aggressive precision. Her makeup likely cost more than a typical car payment, and her expression had already tried and convicted me of some unknown crime. The two movers, who had probably witnessed every variety of neighbor drama, exchanged a knowing glance and suddenly became intensely focused on their work inside the truck. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice hitting a frequency that could make dogs howl even before she reached my property line. "You cannot park that vehicle here. It's a violation of community standards. I need to see your authorization paperwork. Immediately." Authorization papers to move into my own house. I set down the box I was carrying, labeled Sarah's books, and turned to face what was clearly my introduction to the infamous HOA president the real estate agent had vaguely warned me about. Her very active community leadership was clearly code for a tyrant who micromanaged everyone's lives. "Good morning," I said, striving for civility. I genuinely wanted a fresh start without conflict. "I'm Jackson Reeves. I just closed on this house yesterday. The truck will be gone in a few hours once we finish unloading." She looked at me as if I had just declared myself the king of Mars. "That's impossible. This property belongs to the Garrison estate. They would never sell to someone like—" She paused, her eyes scanning my worn jeans and faded MIT t-shirt, clearly categorizing me as unworthy of the neighborhood. "Someone who hasn't been properly vetted by the homeowners association." "I am Bethany Cromwell," she announced, "HOA president for the past 11 years. I can assure you, no sale of this property has received association approval. The Garrison estate, that was rich. Old Mr. Garrison had died 8 months prior with no heirs, and the house had gone through probate before being listed. But Bethany Cromwell was either uninformed or so accustomed to controlling everything that the idea of a sale happening without her blessing was inconceivable. "I have all the paperwork right here," I said, pulling out my phone to show her the closing documents. "We finalized everything yesterday at 4 o'clock with Lakeside Title Company. Would you like to see the deed?" She recoiled from my phone as if it were diseased. "I don't need to examine fraudulent documents. Any sale in waterfront estates requires HOA approval, which you clearly lack. This is obviously a scam, and I'm contacting the authorities immediately." The movers had stopped pretending to work and were now openly spectating. One of them, a guy with a Detroit Strong tattoo, caught my eye and mouthed, "Good luck," with the sympathy you'd give someone about to have a root canal. "Ma'am," I tried again, "I purchased this house legally. I have the deed, the mortgage papers, everything. I'm not sure what the confusion is, but—" "The confusion," she cut in, her voice rising to a glass-shattering pitch, "is that you are trespassing on private property in a gated community where you clearly do not belong. I'm calling 911, and you should hope they're lenient with the fraud charges you'll be facing." She pulled out a phone that cost more than some people's rent and theatrically dialed, ensuring I saw every button press. The performance was meant to intimidate me into leaving, But Bethany Cromwell had no idea what I had been doing for the past 6 months, which was far more interesting than just buying a single lake house. If you've ever encountered someone who mistakes a tiny position of power for a dictatorship, you know exactly how this unfolds. While Bethany was delivering a dramatic soliloquy to the 911 dispatcher, claiming I was potentially armed and dangerous, I noticed something telling. 3 other neighbors had come out to watch, but they didn't look surprised. They looked weary, the deep exhaustion that comes from years of dealing with an inescapable, draining person. An elderly man across the street caught my eye and gave a small shrug that seemed to say, "Welcome to the neighborhood. This is our reality." A younger woman 2 houses down was recording everything on her phone, likely for a neighborhood social media page. A middle-aged man next door, washing his boat, had stopped to watch with the expression of someone who knew exactly how this scene would end. "Yes, officer." "He's refusing to leave," Bethany proclaimed, loud enough for the whole street to hear. "He claims to own the Garrison house, which is absolutely impossible. He has a suspicious truck and several accomplices. This could be an organized burglary ring. Accomplices." She was referring to the licensed, bonded moving company whose logo was emblazoned on the truck in letters visible from orbit. But in Bethany's world, anyone she hadn't personally approved was automatically a criminal. The police arrived in about 12 minutes, impressive response time for a false report about a man standing in his own driveway. Officer Raymond Hutchinson stepped out of the patrol car with the weary demeanor of someone who had been summoned for Bethany Cromwell's complaints many times before. "Mrs. Cromwell," he said with a professionalism that deserved an award, "what seems to be the issue today?" "This man," she declared, pointing at me as if I were in a lineup, "is trespassing and fraudulently claiming to own the Garrison property. He has no HOA approval, no verified documentation, and is clearly operating an elaborate scam. I need him arrested and removed immediately." Officer Hutchinson looked at me, then at the moving truck, then at the boxes labeled kitchen and bedroom, then back at Bethany with an expression that suggested he was counting the days until his pension. "Sir, may I see some identification and any documentation you have for this property?" I handed him my driver's license and pulled up the closing documents and recorded deed on my phone. Officer Hutchinson reviewed everything carefully while Bethany provided a running commentary about document forgery, sophisticated criminals, and neighborhood safety. "Mr. Reeves," the officer said after a moment, "everything appears to be in order. This is your home. You're free to continue moving in." Watching Bethany's face was like seeing a person's entire worldview implode in real time. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly like a fish stranded on a riverbank. That's impossible," she finally stammered. "I would have been notified. The HOA must approve all sales. This is clearly an oversight that requires investigation." "Ma'am," Officer Hutchinson said, his exhaustion barely concealed, "Mr. Reeves is the legal owner of this property. He has every right to be here. Making false reports to 911 is a crime, and if you continue to harass him, you could face charges." But Bethany Cromwell wasn't someone who accepted defeat, especially not in front of an audience. She drew herself up to her full height, still several inches shorter than me, even in her heels, and delivered what she clearly believed was a fatal blow. "Fine. But as HOA president, I'm putting you on notice, Mr. Reeves. You may have somehow acquired this property through improper channels, but you will adhere to every single rule and regulation. I will be monitoring your every move, and your first violation will result in immediate fines and legal action. The Garrison house has been vacant for 8 months, and I'm certain there are numerous code violations requiring immediate attention. I will be conducting a full inspection this afternoon." She spun on her heel and marched back to her house. A massive Mediterranean-style mansion that looked like it was designed by someone who considered subtlety a form of illness. Officer Hutchinson watched her go with the look of a man who wished he were anywhere else. "Word of advice," he said quietly for my ears only. "Document everything. She's filed complaints against every new resident for the last 5 years. The department has a dedicated file for her calls. Good luck, and welcome to the neighborhood, I suppose." As his patrol car departed, I noticed several neighbors giving me subtle thumbs-ups or nods of approval. Apparently, merely standing up to Bethany Cromwell, even unsuccessfully, earned you some respect here. The man washing his boat walked over. Extending a hand, he quickly wiped on his shorts before offering it again. "Pete Morrison," he said with a grin. "That was the fastest I've ever seen her call the cops on someone. Usually it takes at least a day. You must have really set her off." Jackson Reeves. "And I honestly don't know what I did besides exist." Pete laughed, a sound filled with years of pent-up frustration. "That's all it takes with Bethany. She's convinced she owns this entire neighborhood. Has been ever since her husband made his fortune in medical devices and they bought the biggest house on the street. Fair warning, she wasn't kidding about the inspections. She once fined the Johnsons $3,000 for grass that was half an inch too long. $3,000 for grass. I was starting to understand why the previous owner's estate had been so eager to sell quickly and quietly. How is that even legal? I asked. It's usually not, Pete said, but her brother-in-law is a judge, and her cousin runs the biggest law firm in town. Most people just pay the fines to avoid the legal harassment. I looked across the street at Bethany's mansion, then at the other houses lining Waterfront Boulevard. What Pete didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had spent the last 6 months quietly acquiring properties through a series of shell companies and private deals. The Garrison House was merely the final piece of a much larger puzzle. "Pete, can I ask you something? How many people here actually enjoy living under Bethany's rule?" He snorted.
Are you kidding?
"Nobody can stand her, but she controls the HOA board through intimidation and strategic alliances with a few other busybodies who enjoy the power trip. We've tried to vote her out 3 times, but she always finds a way to invalidate the results or scare off any opposition." "Interesting," I said, and I meant it, because in about 3 hours, Bethany Cromwell was going to learn that her reign of terror had a major flaw. She had been collecting HOA fees and issuing fines for properties she had no authority over, properties that, as of yesterday's closing, all had the same owner, me. The movers continued working through the drama, and by noon, most of my furniture was in place. I had chosen the Garrison House for its history and character. Built in 1923 by a lumber baron, it had good bones. Despite being empty for months, I was in the kitchen unpacking when the doorbell rang with the aggressive persistence of someone who believes their time is supremely valuable. Through the window, I saw Bethany on my porch, armed with a stack of paperwork and a small contingent of what I assumed were other HOA board members. 3 women and 1 man, all dressed for a country club luncheon rather than harassing a new neighbor. When I opened the door, I was hit by a wave of expensive perfumes that probably violated international chemical weapons agreements. "Mr. Reeves," Bethany said with the fake sweetness of poisoned honey, "I'm here for the mandatory HOA inspection. These are board members Patricia Lansing, Dorothy Chen, Margaret Blackwood, and our treasurer, Harold Worthington." They each nodded as named, though Harold looked like he'd rather be undergoing a medical procedure. He had the defeated air of a man who had long since surrendered in his wife's wars. "I wasn't aware there was such a thing as a mandatory inspection," I said pleasantly. "Could you show me the specific bylaw that authorizes this?" Bethany's eye twitched, but she recovered quickly, producing a document that looked freshly printed. Section 47, subsection 3, paragraph A, clearly states that the HOA board has the right to inspect any property within 30 days of ownership. Changed to ensure compliance with community standards. I took the paper and made a show of reading it carefully. Hastily fabricated bylaws rarely hold up to scrutiny, and this one was especially amusing, referencing state statutes that had been repealed 3 years prior. "This is fascinating," I said. "But I see this document isn't notarized, lacks the required state filing number, and cites legal codes that no longer exist. Do you have the actual legally filed HOA bylaws, the ones registered with the state?" Patricia Lansing, a woman who appeared to survive on a diet of judgment and cottage cheese, spoke up. "Bethany maintains all official documents. If she says it's valid, then it's valid." "That's not how legal documents work," I replied. "But let me save us all some time. You are not entering my house without a court order. If you have specific maintenance concerns, you can submit them in writing through proper legal channels. Bethany's face was turning a shade of red that clashed horribly with her coral lipstick. You cannot refuse an HOA inspection. I will fine you $500 per day until you comply. You're welcome to try, I said calmly. I'll be happy to see you in court, where you can explain to a judge how you're enforcing non-existent bylaws on a property outside your jurisdiction. Don't have jurisdiction, she practically shrieked. I am the HOA president. I have jurisdiction over every property in waterfront estates, and that's when I decided to offer the first small hint of what was coming. Actually, Bethany, you might want to review the original neighborhood covenants from 1923. They're quite specific about which properties fall under HOA authority. The Garrison House, for instance, predates the HOA's formation by 30 years. It was never actually part of the association. The silence that followed was beautiful. You could see the gears turning in her head as she processed this. Harold, I noticed, was fighting back a smile. That's ridiculous, she sputtered. We've been collecting HOA fees from this property for years. Have you? I asked innocently. That's interesting because I've reviewed the records and Herbert Garrison never paid a single HOA fee in the 43 years he lived here. In fact, he had extensive correspondence with your predecessor about the HOA's lack of authority over his property. Would you like me to share those letters? They're quite entertaining. Dorothy Chen, who had been silent until now, suddenly looked anxious. Bethany, perhaps we should research this before. We are not backing down, Bethany snapped. This is clearly a technicality he's exploiting. Every house in this neighborhood is part of the HOA. That's how it's always been. Actually, I said, perhaps enjoying this a bit too much, that's not how it's always been. But don't worry. You'll have plenty of time to research the actual history. Now, unless you have a court order, I need you to leave my property. Bethany looked like she might have an aneurysm on my porch. Her manicured nails were digging into her clipboard so hard I thought it might splinter. This isn't over, Mr. Reeves. You've just made a very powerful enemy. I will make your life here absolutely miserable. You'll be begging to sell within a month. I doubt that, I said. But you're welcome to try. Have a nice day. I closed the door on their stunned faces and returned to unpacking, though I could hear them arguing on my porch for another 10 minutes before they finally left. The rest of the afternoon was peaceful, if you ignored the obvious surveillance from Bethany's house. Her curtains twitched every few minutes, and at one point, she set up a tripod with a camera pointed directly at my front door. The woman was as subtle as a sledgehammer. Around 4 o'clock, Pete Morrison came over with a 6-pack of beer and what he called a neighborhood survival kit, a folder filled with documents, chronicling Bethany's various offenses over the years. Figured you should know what you're dealing with, he said, settling into a deck chair on my porch overlooking the lake. This is just the stuff we could prove. There's probably 10 times more that people were too frightened to document. The folder was a testament to suburban tyranny. Fines for unauthorized happiness, Christmas decorations left up one day too long, excessive child enjoyment, kids playing in their own yard after 5 p.m., photos of Bethany measuring grass with a ruler, and testimonials from families who had moved away to escape her. And this one's my favorite, Pete said, pulling out a photo of Bethany using a tape measure to check the distance between a mailbox and the curb. She fined the Washingtons $800 because their mailbox was 2 inches too close to the street. 2 inches? How has no one sued her into oblivion? A few have tried, but she has deep pockets and that judge brother-in-law. Plus, she's clever. She never quite crosses the line into criminal territory, staying in that gray area of technically maybe legal if you have an expensive lawyer. I was about to reply when my phone buzzed with an email that made me smile. It was from my attorney, David Sterling, confirming that all property transfers had been officially recorded with the county as of 5 p.m. Every rental, vacation home, and investment property on Waterfront Boulevard now belonged to Sebza Holdings, LLC, a company I wholly owned. Pete, can I ask you something? How much are your HOA fees? $400 a month. It's insane, but it's supposedly for neighborhood maintenance and private beach access. And what maintenance actually gets done? He laughed bitterly. Are you kidding? The roads are cracked, the beach is neglected, and the only thing maintained is Bethany's ego. We've asked for financial transparency for years, but she always claims the records are being audited. Interesting. And how many rental properties are in the neighborhood? He thought for a moment. Maybe 7 or 8? Why? Just curious about the neighborhood dynamics, I said, which was partially true. I was very curious how everyone would react when they learned their HOA president had been collecting fees from properties she had no authority over, including the 7 rentals. 3 vacation homes and 2 disputed estates I now owned. That evening, I was enjoying a peaceful dinner on my deck when I heard a commotion. Bethany was holding an emergency HOA meeting in her driveway, complete with a portable microphone and speaker system that likely violated noise ordinances. "Attention, residents of waterfront estates," her voice crackled through the speaker. "Due to the unprecedented security threat posed by our new neighbor, I'm implementing enhanced community safety measures, effective immediately." Security threat. I was eating salmon and reading a book. Clearly, I was public enemy number 1. She listed new rules designed to target me. 48-hour notice for moving trucks, a $500 deposit, a new architectural committee she would chair, and a requirement for new residents to submit to background checks and provide character references from current HOA members. The assembled neighbors looked more confused than concerned. One brave man, Richard, raised his hand. "Bethany, these rules seem excessive and possibly illegal. You can't retroactively apply requirements to someone who's already moved in." She turned on him. "Richard, need I remind you about your deck that's 6 inches wider than approved? I've been lenient, but that could change." Richard immediately fell silent, but I could see others exchanging uneasy glances. The fear was palpable, but so was the growing resentment. The next morning brought a new wave of pettiness. At 6 a.m., I found a fluorescent orange violation notice on my door. My garbage cans were visible from the street. They were behind my car. By noon, I had 6 violations totaling around $800, including my favorite. Excessive quietness indicating possible suspicious activity. She was fining me for not making enough noise, but her campaign hit a snag when she went door to door with a petition for my removal. Most people weren't home or made excuses. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman 3 doors down, actually laughed in her face and threatened her with a rolling pin. That afternoon, I took a walk to assess the neighborhood. Waterfront Boulevard was beautiful, with a private beach that looked neglected for decades. Several neighbors waved or introduced themselves, apologizing for Bethany's behavior. "She wasn't always this bad," said Janet Holmes, who lived 2 doors from Bethany. "When she first became president, she did some good things. But power corrupts, and in her case, it corrupted absolutely." "What changed?" "Her husband's company went public about 5 years ago. Suddenly, they were incredibly wealthy, and she decided that made her superior to everyone else. She started treating the HOA like her personal fiefdom. I filed that information away. The neighborhood had potential. It just needed someone to stand up to the tyrant. Unknowingly, I had volunteered for the job. That evening, while reviewing property documents, I noticed something intriguing. Bethany's house wasn't in her name. It was owned by the Cromwell Family Trust, administered by a Detroit law firm I had dealt with during my acquisitions. I called David Sterling. "David, check the Cromwell Family Trust beneficiaries for me." A moment of typing. "Okay, this is interesting. The trust was set up by Harold Cromwell Sr. Bethany, and her husband are beneficiaries. But there are 3 other children with equal shares. And the trustee is... Hold on, this can't be right. The trustee is listed as Siabzi Holdings, LLC. I smiled. It's not an error. When did that change? Yesterday at 4:47 p.m., right before the recorder's office closed. Thanks, David. I'll explain tomorrow. I hung up, looking out at the lake. Bethany Cromwell was about to learn that her symbol of power wasn't as secure as she thought. The trust had been financially troubled, and the other beneficiaries who despised her had been eager to sell their controlling interest when I made a generous offer. The next morning, my yard was plastered with orange violation notices. It looked like a bizarre art project. Meanwhile, a crowd had gathered in Bethany's driveway for another emergency meeting. About 30 neighbors stood around uncomfortably as she ranted into her microphone. This man is a clear and present danger to our way of life, she declared as I walked out to get my mail. He's shown complete disregard for our rules. I've discovered he's a tech millionaire who probably made his money through shady dealings. I had actually built a cybersecurity company that protected hospitals from ransomware attacks. But facts were clearly irrelevant to her narrative. I propose a special assessment of $5,000 per household to create a legal fund to force him out. We cannot allow an outsider to destroy what we've built. $5,000. She had truly lost touch with reality. I could see the shock on people's faces. Richard found his courage again. Bethany, that's insane. We can't charge people $5,000 because you dislike the new neighbor. He hasn't done anything wrong. Hasn't done anything wrong? She shrieked. He's refused an HOA inspection. He's accumulated over $3,000 in fines. He's probably planning to turn this into a party house. I decided to intervene, walking over with my stack of orange notices. Good morning, everyone. Bethany, I wanted to return these. Littering is a crime in Michigan, punishable by up to 90 days in jail. I've documented everything and filed a report. Her face turned an unhealthy shade of purple. Those are official HOA notices. No, they're harassment. None are valid since, as we discussed, this property isn't under HOA jurisdiction. But please, continue your meeting. I'm especially interested in the part where you're attempting to extort $5,000 from each family for a personal vendetta. It's not extortion. It's a special assessment for neighborhood protection. Protection from what? Me reading books? I notice you haven't told everyone that you've been collecting HOA fees from properties not part of the association. That sounds like fraud. The crowd grew restless. Harold Worthington, the treasurer, seemed to find his backbone. Actually, Bethany, he has a point. We should review which properties are actually in the HOA before collecting more fees. She turned on him. Harold, don't you dare undermine me. Every property in Waterfront Estates is part of the HOA. But if he's right about the Garrison House, someone began. He's not right about anything. Bethany screamed, losing all composure. This man is trying to destroy our community. Can't you see that? I pulled out my phone. Oh, this is interesting. I just received an email from my attorney. Apparently there are 15 properties in Waterfront Estates that were never legally part of the HOA. 15 properties that have been paying fees for years without obligation. That's about $72,000 a year in unauthorized collections. Over 11 years, that's nearly $800,000. I wonder where all that money went. The silence was profound. Everyone stared at Bethany, who looked utterly defeated. Harold had gone pale, frantically checking his phone. You're lying, Bethany said, but her voice lacked conviction. County records are public, I said. I encourage everyone to verify this. Check when your property was built, when the HOA was formed, and if your deed includes HOA membership. You might be surprised. People were already on their phones. I could see the panic in Bethany's eyes. Her kingdom was crumbling. This meeting is adjourned, she said hastily, grabbing her equipment. I need to consult with our legal counsel about these baseless accusations. But the crowd didn't disperse. They gathered in groups, comparing notes and asking questions. The spell was breaking. Pete walked over, grinning. That was beautiful. I haven't seen her that flustered in years. This is just the beginning, I said. Wait until she finds out who actually owns her house. What do you mean? I smiled. Let's just say Bethany is about to learn that bullying has consequences, especially when you're bullying your landlord. As I walked home, I felt the neighborhood's energy shift. People were questioning the status quo. Bethany Cromwell, who had ruled by fear for over a decade, was about to face accountability. That evening, I reviewed the paperwork that would reshape Waterfront Estates. The rental properties were easy acquisitions, absentee owners happy to cash out. The vacation homes required more finesse, but the masterstroke was the Cromwell Trust. Harold Sr.'s other children, who loathed Bethany, had been bleeding money and were thrilled to sell their controlling interest. The next morning at 6 a.m., Bethany was at my door with a man who looked like a Craigslist process server. Mr. Reeves, she announced triumphantly, you're being served with a cease and desist from the HOA. You have 24 hours to pay all fines or face legal action. I took the papers, which were legally worthless, and smiled. Bethany, perfect timing. I have something for you, too. I handed her an envelope. She tore it open, her expression shifting from triumph to confusion as she read. It was a notice that Siabzi Holdings, LLC, as the new trustee, would be conducting a full inspection of her property the next day at 9 a.m. This is ridiculous. You can't inspect my house. What is Siabzi Holdings? Siabzi Holdings is the company that now controls the trust that owns your house, Bethany. You might want to ask your husband about those papers he signed last week. Something about restructuring for tax purposes.